Okay, can you hear me? Okay. So I'm Melanie Wall. I'm a professor of biostatistics. I'm in the Mailman School of Public Health, and I'm also in the Fagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons. And I have the daunting task of trying to describe to you the NIH and the medical center at this university, which is both quite very large. And as a biostatistician and not an MD myself, I can only talk about the parts that I know. And I'll try to give some signposts to the clinical parts that I think we need more understanding of as well in terms of its role. So we all heard about the $400 million. It was plastered all over the place. And right after the $400 million number came out, Jeanette Wing, who is the executive vice president of research, called it a sort of emergency meeting where they showed lots of pie charts of all the money that comes to the university. And one of the pie charts had some summary of like this year's budget is of the whole university is $6.4 billion. And so 400 million is only 6% of our whole budget of the university. And so we should calm down and we're going to be able to weather the storm. The issue with that is that, of course, across the whole university, that might be true. But at the medical center on 168th Street, which is made up of, I should say, everybody thinks of it as the med school, but it's not just the med school. That's actually a very tiny part of it. So there's the Vagelos College of Physicians and Surgeons, which has 35 departments, one of which is the Department of Medicine. And there's the Mailman School of Public Health, which has 6 departments. There's the School of Nursing, and there's the School of Dentistry. And I know very well about the Mailman School, and I know about the Department of Psychiatry, which is one of the 35 departments in the College of Physicians and Surgeons. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in terms of how much $400 million is with regard to that. So it's pretty well known that the most leveraged school at the medical center or department is the Mailman School of Public Health. Indeed, in terms of revenue that comes to the university, the pie chart that Jeanette Wing's office showed was something like 25% of the money comes from clinical reimbursements from insurance companies for physicians who are seeing patients. Another approximately 25% comes from tuition, 30% comes from grants, and then whatever the remaining 20% is coming from various kinds of gifts and endowments. But in the Mailman School, there's $0 coming from clinical, and in fact, they're 80% coming from grants and about 15% from tuition, and then whatever the remaining is. So they're completely leveraged with federal grants, or most completely. In the Department of Psychiatry, which again is only one of the 35 that are in the College of Physicians and Surgeons, I can tell you about that because I've seen that pie chart too at a faculty meeting, which all came, there was lots of pie charts right after the announcement of the funding cuts. And that one showed us that in our Department of Psychiatry, we have around 40% coming from clinical services, another 40% coming from external research grants, which I'm going to talk a lot about, and then the remaining from various endowments and sort of fixed money. In the College of Physicians and Surgeons, basically the missions are research, patient care, education, and community service. There are, and I know this because I was actually worked with Janine Damiato about 6 years ago now, back in 2019, to look at the, actually it was a study to look at the gender distribution of faculty on the medical campus. And so I have some actual numbers from a paper we published from that there's actually, at least in 2018, there was 2,100 faculty on the medical campus, and that is across the 4 schools that I've mentioned. 80% of those faculty are non-tenure track. Basically means all of their funding is coming from something that's not directly Columbia University. It's coming from some kind of soft money or from clinical funding. That varies a lot depending on what department you're from. As has been mentioned, what is soft money? One thing to understand about that is typically it's referring to external funds. In the case of myself and in several of the examples I'm going to give you, it's from the National Institute of Health. And one important thing about it is it's not guaranteed year to year. So almost by definition, soft money means you're getting the money from the outside, and it's a contract with an outside agency like the National Institute of Health. But even though we get the grant with the potential to have it for 5 years, us getting it each of those years has to be renewed, and it's renewed through a process, progress report, but it's also dependent upon the government issuing a budget that will allow it to be paid in the next year. So whenever we get a grant, the budget isn't guaranteed by the federal government. It's just guaranteed for the next year, even though we have it for 5 years. So all of that soft money, a key component is it is not guaranteed from year to year. I mentioned that the mix varies widely in terms of where people get their funding from. Many people have combinations. So my MD colleagues will have some portion of their salary paid for through their clinical services. Sometimes a lot of their salary would be paid for through their clinical services. And then they might have a grant to pay the rest of their salary, NIH grant. Others, and typically the teams who are working, the PhDs who are working together with clinical MDs, would be almost entirely funded from the federal dollars. In the two departments that I'm part of, which is the Department of Biostatistics and Mailman and the Department of Psychiatry in the College of Physicians and Surgeons, we're required to have 90% of our salary covered from external sources. So there's not any Columbia money that is guaranteed to me each year. I have to figure out how my salary is going to be covered. I'm also tenured, but that's a different story. That money doesn't come either. So where do we get that money? So we get it from the National Institute of Health, and in fact, in my case, almost entirely from the National Institute of Health. And just to give you a flavor of a few of the kinds of grants. So the holy grail of NIH funding is the R01, which is a principal investigator initiated project where a team of researchers come up with an idea that they think is important to study and are basically asking the government to give them money to study that. Most R01s pay up to $500,000 a year. That's both direct and indirect costs and are usually for between 3 and 5 years. You can't have it for more than 5 years. The direct costs are very closely audited and must be used only to do the research that you said you're going to do. So you can't get the grant and then use it to do something else. In fact, you have to report regularly on every grant that the effort you paid yourself to do it, that you could show that you did something for that. There's a process for that is highly monitored. So it pays people's salaries to do the research, as well as if there's subject recruitment costs or any kind of equipment. That's the direct cost. The indirect costs, has been mentioned, is to pay the lights and so forth. But particularly on the medical campus, the indirect costs also go to all of the regulatory work that needs to be done with regard to human subjects research and compliance and making sure that we're keeping subjects safe in our studies. And that is a gigantic operation. And that's also paid for through the indirect costs. So NIH also has similar pay line with most universities, 60%. Around 60%, and cutting that to 15%, which is of course what the Trump administration is still proposing to do, would be a gigantic change in our ability to basically do ethical research. To give you an idea of the kinds of projects we get funded, I think an important point, actually, based on the discussion earlier about the history of whether the funding should be coming from private versus public. An important thing to emphasize, I think, is the projects, at least that I've worked on throughout my 25 years in an academic health center, wouldn't get done, I don't think, by any private organization, because they're not money making. Or if they were going to get done, they would be getting done in a particularly biased way in order to make money. So, for example, one of our studies is looking at the impact of all the changes in the medical marijuana laws, both for medical reasons as well as for recreation reasons, and trying to look at the trends as it relates to that. So that's a very kind of common, important problem that we'd like to have sort of unbiased scientists looking at, rather than, say, like the people who are selling the marijuana. So that's a study. It was a 5-year study. Because it didn't, we ended up utilizing existing claims records from the VA to do that study. And so there was no new patients being examined. So in the end, all the money that we needed for it was going to pay investigator salaries to organize the data, look at trends, discuss the best way to analyze it and do the interpretation. And that grant, it's a 5-year grant, each of those investigators on the study would be paid approximately 10 to 20% of their salary to work on that, because they're then also working on other things. A few people were hired at full time as coordinators, and they were hired for the period of the time when we would have the grant. Another example of something that probably wouldn't get done if it wasn't without for public money is related to investigation of treatments for schizophrenia. So, in fact, the pharmaceutical companies have really stepped back from trying to look for new drug discoveries in schizophrenia, because there's just not been sort of any good leads lately. And one of this particular study with an MD colleague who during the day sees patients with schizophrenia, but then also during the day, has started a research portfolio focusing on glutamatergic mechanisms in the brain for why it is some of these drugs aren't working the way they think they should work. And so there had been many promising preclinical, meaning in rodents, models for these particular glutamate targeting agents, and they weren't showing any progress in clinical trials that actually pharma companies were doing. And so my colleague is continuing to try to understand why it works in rodents, but it's not working in humans, by doing brain imaging studies to understand, and it's actually found that certain types of auditory hallucinations that people are having seem to be particularly promising as a subgroup of patients where this actually might work. So it's kind of precision medicine problem. I mentioned that most of my salary comes from grants. So 90% of my salary comes from grants. That's across, actually, in my case, as a senior statistician who provides typically oversight for the statistical analysis. I'm on 19 different NIH research projects right now. 7 of them have been terminated. I want to just briefly, I know we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to briefly emphasize something that was just mentioned about the stringency of the amount of competition it goes through to get these studies. So to get these studies I just gave you as examples, and all the 19 I'm currently working on, we had to submit a proposal. Actually, most of them we had to submit multiple times, because the pay line to get only 20% or less, actually depends on the institute at NIH, between 5 and 20% of the grants that are submitted get funded. It's reviewed with an emphasis on overall impact, which I think was interesting, relating the applied versus basic science. NIH is definitely about the applied. So overall impact, significance, innovation, who the investigators are, do you have a good approach? An important one, and the one that is currently causing us a problem, is you're supposed to have a good environment. And as we know, the federal government doesn't think Columbia has a good environment right now. Then when you submit it, and we submit grants 3 times a year, everybody knows that February, June, and October are terrible months for investigators on the 168th Street, because we're all submitting grants. They throw out the bottom half of the scores. So each one is reviewed by 3 scientific experts, your peers that are from other universities. I've been a reviewer at NIH my entire 25 years career, reviewing other people's grants, not my own. 3 people review it, they score it. If you're in the bottom half of that batch that came through that time, usually there's about 30 that come to a particular study section, it's thrown on the floor, and then the upper half get discussed, and they get ranked by the score, which is made by the 25 people that are in the room after they've listened to the case for each of the grants. Then it goes to council, NIH council, where they then take into account that federal budget and ask whether there's enough money to fund how many grants this year. And then you either get it or you don't. Before I end, I want to mention that there are a whole bunch of other types of grants, importantly, and the ones that you might have been hearing about in the press that were severely affected at Columbia, at least so far. I think there's rumors that they're all going to be affected in the next few weeks, but are what are called the training grants. And so NIH provides funds to universities to build programs to train future clinician scientists. And all of the training grants at Columbia Medical Center were canceled. And that funds both pre-docs and post-docs training in clinical research. So I mentioned that 7 of the grants I'm on are terminated. All of the training grants, I'm a statistical mentor for those training grants, approximately 30 young scientists, part of those training grants that are now terminated. I think it's important also to make sure we point out, yes, things right now suck at Columbia, but it sucks across the country. You know, there's been over 200 institutions across the country that have had grants cut by the NIH. 94 of them are in red states. It's across the board. While it's particularly bad in the Ivies right now, it's happening across the board. So in terms of what next, I don't know. I said earlier, the car crash is happening right now, so I don't know how we can plan for what to do once the car finally stops. But I'm thankful for this opportunity. I think what AAUP is doing by putting on these teach-ins is an important next step. Let's just keep doing more of that to try to educate not just our own community. I do recognize that our own community needs educating in terms of how the university works, but that'll then make us stronger when we try to speak out to the wider community, in particular, hopefully start to influence the, our legislators and hopefully make some larger impact at the political level. I don't know how else we can do that, but in closing, I'll just say, if we're not able to do that, I think basically research is going to go elsewhere. I think we already know that other countries are like trying to look for the, I've been called regularly from the Netherlands, from France, from Germany. I haven't had any Asian countries call yet for asking how, whether researchers are ready to move. But it's obviously the case that the research is going to go on somewhere, but it's just not going to probably go on here. Sorry, just to end on a doom statement.